Hey guys, this is Ryan. Welcome to Unit 3. This is the judicial branch. This is all about the court system, judicial review, interpreting the Constitution. So let's get started. The things that we're going to talk about in Unit 3 start with the U.S. Supreme Court, how we break down laws between civil and criminal courts, how we select court justices, and what the job of the courts is overall. The global context that we chose for Unit 3 are fairness and development. Fairness is what we think of when we think of the court system. We think of the Supreme Court and other courts deciding what is fair and what's not fair, who is right in a certain situation and who might be wrong. But it also develops over time, it also changes over time. Which takes us right into the key concept for Unit 3, which is change. Change in this case defined as a conversion or a transformation from one thing to another over time. So the court system changes a lot from the time the Constitution is written in 1789 all the way to the present. Our related concepts are power and rights. Power can refer to a lot of different people in Unit 3, but mostly it refers to the people of the United States, the citizens, as well as the power of the justices in the judicial branch. The statement of inquiry that we chose for Unit 3 is what we define as fair changes over time. Statement of inquiries are designed to be debatable questions for our scholars, and I hope that this statement enables our scholars to think in multiple ways about the definition of fairness and about the definition changing over time. The answer to this statement of inquiry is almost always yes, the definition of fair changes over time. However, the degree to which that definition of fair changes will be different from scholar to scholar, and it will be interesting to see how the scholars break down the definition of fair and when they see changes happening and whether they think those changes are for good reasons or for bad reasons, or whether those changes were a long time coming or whether they were unnecessary to begin. Following up the statement of inquiry are the inquiry questions. So when I build inquiry questions for a unit, I like to start with the debatable questions. What do I want my scholars to argue about? What do I want them to learn and take away? And what do I want them to think about throughout this entire unit? And so that's how I crafted these debatable questions. Questions like, do all people deserve equal rights? And how should we handle conflict when dealing with civil rights? We want to be mindful that these can be touchy subjects for a lot of people, including a lot of our scholars. A lot of our scholars will have very real and very authentic feelings, and it could be very strong one way or another on these questions in particular, especially if they've impacted their lives. After I create debatable questions, that's when I go back and think about conceptual and factual questions and how can I get my scholars to think on this deeper level, and what pieces of knowledge do scholars need to know before they can adequately answer those debatable questions and have deep, meaningful, authentic discussions. This obviously is not an exhaustive list of questions, but it is a list that if you teach these things, it will be very beneficial for your scholars, and they will be more capable of answering the debatable questions and having those meaningful discussions that we want our scholars to have. The assessment for Unit 3, again, just like Unit 2, is not a traditional exam that is multiple choice and essays, but instead is a project or a production that scholars will complete to help me assess whether scholars understand or have learned this information. The assessment that I've designed for Unit 3 puts our scholars in the mind of a law student, with you, their teacher, as the professor. I've asked scholars to choose a Supreme Court case that deals with the civil rights. They can choose any of a list of about 25 that I've pre-selected, and I've asked scholars to detail that case and research that case from start to finish, from the day that it became a court case all the way through the Supreme Court decision, which could be a very short amount of time, less than a year, or it could be several years. With the research that scholars do on this project, they will use that information to create a 800 to 1,000 word essay, and that essay should detail the Supreme Court case start to finish. With only 800 to 1,000 words to write, that's about 3 pages maximum. Scholars will need to be concise in everything that they write. After the scholars write their essay detailing their court case, I'm going to ask them to go back and reflect on the statement of inquiry that we've been talking about for several weeks at this point. And I'm going to ask them to write about 500 words and to decide, does the definition of fair change over time, and has our government changed that definition over time? In addition to that, I'm going to have my scholars write a 500-word reflection on the statement of inquiry that we've been discussing for several weeks at this point. Does the definition of fair change over time, and has the government kept everyone in mind when dealing with civil rights? These answers may vary from scholar to scholar based on the cases that they received or that they chose to research. However, the general answer should be yes, the definition has changed. I'll be interested to see to what degree each scholar believes that definition has changed and how it impacts the people of the United States now. The learning experiences that I've created for Unit 3 are different most days, but I did want to highlight Lesson 1, which I've created to be an introduction, but also a way for scholars to once again practice the text analysis and evaluation of a primary source. So I've chosen Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, and I've chosen an OPCVL strategy so that scholars can work with another primary source and try to break it down on their own. As I give more and more text analysis, I like to step back more and allow scholars to do more work on their own instead of me guiding them through each piece. So Article 3 will be their third chance to work with the Constitution directly. So by now I would hope that scholars are able to break most of these things down on their own. And instead of guiding scholars through it, I'll instead give them time to work on their own and then have a group check in to make sure that scholars are accomplishing what the purpose of the lesson. All of the other learning strategies through Lesson 9 can all be found in the strategy bank in the Humanities Guide. And I wanted to point your attention to Lessons 10 and 11. Currently, they're set up as interactive instruction. During Lessons 10 and 11, I've set those up as flex days for my class. Those are when my scholars will give presentations based upon the research that they've done about each Supreme Court case. That presentation is meant to be a formative assessment in my class. If you choose not to do that, that's perfectly fine. You can use these as flex days, or you can use these to catch up, because I know that we've been moving through Units 1, 2, and 3 very quickly. So you may find that you need a couple extra days to work, but it also is a good time for you to give the exam that you've created for your class. Since I did not give a traditional exam for Unit 3, I'm using these for the presentations and the formative assessment based on the research paper that my scholars have been working on. A little bit more about the research project. Two very good resources are Oyez.com and uscourts.gov. Oyez.com is a very scholar-friendly website that breaks down Supreme Court cases, specifically major landmark Supreme Court cases, but they also work directly with a number of other organizations. Two of my favorites are the Legal Information Institute, which can be linked directly from Oyez.com, and Justia, which can also be linked directly in most Supreme Court cases. uscourts.gov is a bit less student-friendly, but is, I think, even more helpful, especially to your higher achieving scholars that want to do additional research about cases that are similar or related to the case that they chose. So these are two really good resources. I will link these in the resource bank on Blackboard, but I wanted to make you aware of them now. So let's do kind of a breakdown of what each day looks like. I won't go through all 11 days on this schedule, but I do want to highlight some of the more impactful days. Day 1, your student learning objective is explain the structure of the court system and the process of becoming a judge. The process of becoming a judge can be found directly in the OPCVL in Article 3 of the Constitution, so I think that one will be simple for you to work with and break down that primary source. But when you discuss the structure of the court system, one really important detail that some people leave out, and that I want to make you aware of, is that the state court system and the federal court system are totally separate entities that will only interact once a case has made it all the way through the several levels of the state court system, and then can be appealed directly to the U.S. Supreme Court system. So you'll see on the left side of this graphic that cases involving state and local law start in the state trial courts and then move to the state appeals courts and then finally to the state Supreme Courts. 99.9% of cases never make it beyond the state Supreme Courts, but if a case were still being appealed, it would be appealed directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. The federal court system is very similar. Cases involving federal laws go to a U.S. District Court first, and then the U.S. Court of Appeals, and then finally the U.S. Supreme Court. You would never take a case to the U.S. District Court and then to appeal it to a state court. It's also important to point out that cases involving foreign diplomats or the entire state government for one particular state would not go through that particular state system. They would go directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. Day 2 is a compare and contrast of two pretty simple ideas, civil law and criminal law, and then another compare and contrast of civil rights versus civil liberties. So you'll see here that I have chosen O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson is a really easy target for, or a really easy example of civil law and criminal law, because his case in particular in the 1990s had both civil and criminal aspects. He had to go through court 2 different times. Once for his criminal trial, which you see there in the picture, where he had to try on the glove. But then again, he went through the civil court system because the family of his ex-wife sued him for damages, essentially. So you just want to highlight that criminal law or criminal court is where people go if they have committed some kind of crime. So that's pretty... And civil court is when 2 people are having a dispute and they are arguing with each other and they ask a judge to figure it out for them. In criminal cases, punishments can range from fines to community service, prison time. In civil cases, punishment will almost always be some amount of financial compensation. Civil rights and civil liberties, the difference sometimes seems daunting and difficult, but I usually try to keep it as simple as possible, and I try to do it in one slide if possible. Civil rights are government guarantees of equality. They usually apply to large groups of people, usually minorities. Other groups that have benefited from civil rights are women, the LGBTQ community, and people between the age of 18 to 21. Civil liberties, on the other hand, are specific protections of individuals from government interference. So they're not these grand guarantees of equality, but instead they are a list of protections that you have from the government. Civil liberties, unlike civil rights, are usually very individualized, and they protect you as an individual or as a person from an overreaching government. Days 3, 4, and 5 are pretty simple, but day 6 is kind of the next big day. We all have different ways for teaching these several court cases that our scholars need to know. There's about 20 of them that our scholars need to know. So the way that I've chosen to do that is by assigning one to each scholar and allowing them to research and then bring that case to class and break it down for us in class. But another way that I've done this is by breaking it down by where it falls in the Constitution. So these are 5 major cases that highlight the 5 major freedoms found in the First Amendment, ranging from freedom of speech with Texas versus Johnson to freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, and freedom of religion. I like to jigsaw these 5 cases together. I use this as an introductory project for my scholars to practice the presentations and research papers that they'll do on their own throughout the rest of Unit 3. Day 7 is one of the more fun days in Unit 3. In my class, we like to put Goldilocks on trial. So you can see that here. The trial of Goldilocks is basically Goldilocks is a real girl that gets lost in the woods, and she breaks and enters into a home that is owned by the Bear family, and then she is found in that home with part of the Bear's property in her possession, and then she's put on trial by the justice system, by the court system, to decide if she is guilty of the crime of burglary. You can find this resource on Blackboard, and I will link to the video that you need to use It's kind of an old hokey video, but it is a lot of fun, especially if you kind of buy into it and make fun of it a little bit with the kids. Day 9 is the last one we're going to talk about. Asks you to, or asks scholars, to describe the outcomes and effects of the Civil and Equal Rights Amendments. The other name for those amendments are the Reconstruction Amendments. These are the 3 amendments that came directly after the Civil War, within 10 years after the Civil War. And these 3 things are pretty simple, but a lot of scholars get these mixed up. So it is beneficial for you to break them down one more time. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to freed slaves, and the 15th Amendment gives the right to vote for all. This is also a good time for you to introduce the two-party system, which we'll begin to talk about in Unit 4 with political socialization, and have scholars maybe break down what they currently believe about the Republican and Democratic parties, and juxtapose that information with how the Republican and Democratic Party and the members of those parties voted on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. I think that a lot of scholars will be shocked by this, but it's also a good time for you to bring up the two-party system and the eventual great party switch that we see happening in the early 20th century. The last thing that I want to mention in today's preview is when you give a lot of projects, as I tend to do in class, one thing that I really like to use are fill-in rubrics. Fill-in rubrics are just like a printed version or a digital version of the rubric that I've already given scholars when I assigned a project. Every one of my projects comes with a rubric so that scholars know exactly what they will be graded on, and how to be successful. So I use that fill-in rubric, and I circle the things that I thought that scholars did well, and I write notes about the things that I missed throughout their presentation or in their paper or in their research or whatever the project is. And then I give this rubric back to the scholars so that they know exactly how I graded them, and exactly what they need to do to correct it and to do better on the next assessment. So that's just a bug that I want to put in your ear. Consider using rubrics every time that you give an assessment so that they can better understand what they did well and what they still need to work on. As always, if you guys have any questions, please email me. If you need anything, please email me.